Hello again, friends, and welcome to another reading vlog and another author taste test. Back in March, I did an author taste test reading vlog for Agustina Bazterrica, which I will have linked down below if you want to watch, and I had such a good time doing that I thought I might expand it into a little vlog series of sorts. The idea is that if I have at least 2 books in my possession from a new-to-me author I've never read from before, I will do a vlog where I read those 2 books and see what I think of that author's work. This week, I will finally be dipping my toes into Marisa Crane's work, which I'm very excited about. I checked out what I believe is their debut novel, I Keep My Exoskeletons to Myself, from my local library, and I also have a galley of their upcoming book, A Sharp Endless Need, which was sent to me by my friends at the Dial Press. I'm also fortunate to be part of the PRH Audio Influencer program, and I have early access to the audiobook for A Sharp Endless Need as well, which is read by Danny Martinek, aka one of my absolute favorite non-binary voice actors. Today is just a quick intro to both books before I dive into them, so let's just get started with I Keep My Exoskeletons to Myself. I've had my eye on this one for quite a few years, ever since it came out. It's pitched as Department of Speculation meets Black Mirror, and it's a queer speculative story about a queer mom trying to raise her daughter in a deeply unjust surveillance state. So it takes place in a near-future version of the US where the Department of Balance has created a radical new form of law enforcement where instead of being incarcerated, wrongdoers and criminals are given an additional shadow as both a physical reminder of the crimes they've committed and as a warning for anyone they come across. The main character is one of these so-called shadesters who's not only grieving the recent loss of her wife, but also trying to raise a baby who was actually born with a second shadow. So it's basically about her struggling to raise a child on her own, dealing with the stigma of having an additional shadow, finding community with other misfits who have been discarded or wronged by the government, and ultimately it's about queer resistance. The very little I read also brought The Dream Hotel by Leila Lalami to mind, which was one of my favorite books of the first quarter because it also seems to be using the speculative to really interrogate authoritarianism and the body as a political battleground. So I have that one in my possession, and I also may or may not have already started listening to A Sharp Endless Need. I am drawn to this one like a moth to the flame. It's a piece of literary fiction that's part nostalgic coming-of-age story, part queer sports romance. So it's about a character named Mac who was the star point guard of her high school basketball team, and it's a retrospective story following her from her senior year of high school when 2 major events changed her life. First, her father very suddenly passed away, and secondly, she gets a new basketball teammate named Liv who transfers to her school. The 2 of them immediately discover they have an exhilarating, game-winning chemistry that skyrockets their team to success, and they also find that that same intoxicating, almost obsessive energy translates to an incredibly strong relationship both on and off the court. But they're living in small-town Pennsylvania in 2004 where girls dating girls is very much not the norm, and so as senior year drags on and Mac is having to confront the college signing deadline, which could once again change the entire trajectory of her life, she has to decide what kind of life and what kind of future she really wants for herself. I'm actually about an hour into this audiobook already and absolutely loving it so far. The writing itself is so electric and so alive. It really does embody that feeling of hazy nostalgia where everything feels so heavy and so urgent, but with a kind of softness and blurriness around the edges. The first chapter of the book, the prologue, is about as close to poetry as you can get. In fact, I would argue that it is absolutely a prose poem, and I cannot be convinced otherwise. I felt it so deep in my bones. The author literally quotes Hanif Abdurraqib to set the tone for the book, if that gives you anything to go off of. I haven't read it myself yet, but in case you don't know, he wrote this absolutely prolific collection of essays called There's Always This Year on basketball and ascension. So if that's your vibe, I feel like this book is the queer fictional equivalent of that. I feel like their energy is very much aligned. I feel like they would make really great reading companions to read either side by side or back to back. Anyways, all of that to say, I am all about this one so far. I don't know if I'm going to try to read both books concurrently and give you updates about both each day, or maybe I finish one and go on to the next. I don't know yet. I'm just going to do whatever feels right, and I hope you come along for the ride. I will have much more to share next. So I have a confession to make. It is actually Wednesday, and y'all are much overdue for an update. I didn't have time to film anything yesterday because I had an appointment out of town, and I was basically gone from like 8 a.m. until almost 5 p.m., so so pretty much the whole day, and I was of course exhausted when I got back. But I did get some good reading done because the trip was about an hour in both directions. I listened to a pretty decent chunk of the audiobook for A Sharp Endless Need, and I actually passed the halfway point. I'm just really loving this so far. There's something so kinetic and energized about the writing. It's so heavily suffused with earnestness, heartache, and yearning, which is especially powerful for a queer coming-of-age story. And like I said before, it's told in a retrospective voice. It's a story about the past and youthfulness as told to us from some undefined point in the future. The narrator is reflecting back on these memories from a distance, and I think that adds to the tension of the story because you get the sense that they know something crucial about how everything unfolds that you don't. And this story is very much a love letter to basketball. It's striking a really great balance for me where you do have those in-game scenes with the characters on the court and they're written and stylized in this heady, almost slow motion way, but you also have even more character and relationship building moments off the court. And I don't think you need to understand basketball or even enjoy basketball to appreciate what the story is doing, especially because those basketball-focused moments are not just for action or entertainment, but they're acting as vehicles for the characters to explore things like intimacy, desire, or physicality. Because these characters are athletes, there's a hyper-awareness of body, of space, of closeness, and the story is exploring how the characters use basketball not only to safely explore and express those things in a quote-unquote appropriate context, but also as a form of validation and as a means to exercise control over themselves, their bodies, and their lives at a time in their lives where very little else is within their control. I really do appreciate how the story is exploring how the sport has a double edge for these characters, especially for Mac. It's one of the few things that she shared with her late father, so there's an aspect of grief. She loves having a built-in community of friends with her teammates, but they can also be very close-minded and openly homophobic, which makes her feel ashamed of herself. And basketball also represents a pathway to her future, but for that very same reason, that pathway can also feel incredibly narrow. Because of those emotional wrinkles and because the characters are so young and reckless, they don't always make the best choices for themselves. The story, even as it's being told to us from the future and from what we can assume is a more wise perspective, gives the characters space to be wrong and destructive and messy. They have these big, confusing feelings about each other and about themselves that they don't have a roadmap to navigate, and I appreciate this story's earnestness and honesty in that sense. So long story short, this is really working for me. I am very much looking forward to listening to even more of this later today. With all that said, I still have not made a proper start on I Keep My Exoskeletons to Myself. Admittedly, these past couple of days, I was finishing up reading Brighter Than Scale, Swifter Than Flame by Neon Yang, which I enjoyed very much for the record. But now that I'm done with this, I have a bit more time and space to give to exoskeletons, so I hope to start that sometime today. I do have a dentist appointment after work today, so that is going to take up a little bit of my afternoon. My time is a little bit more limited because of that, but I'm still hopeful that I will get to start my second book. That's pretty much all I have for you at the moment, but I'll check back in with more tomorrow. Go ahead and make yourself comfortable because I'm gonna yap for a minute. Welcome back. It is now Thursday and things are definitely happening. We are making some pretty big moves. I did get to finally start I Keep My Exoskeletons to Myself yesterday. We'll get to that in a moment, but I did want to say that I was reading the author bio on the back of the dust jacket for Exoskeletons, and it says that the author is a jock and former basketball player. So that makes the pipeline from Exoskeletons to A Sharp Endless Need make a lot more sense. Anyways, let's continue on with A Sharp Endless Need since we were just talking about it yesterday. I don't know that I have too much new to add, but I did want to reaffirm that I am enjoying this so much. Again, now that I know the author has a personal connection to basketball, that really explains why the implementation of sport, both as action and as metaphor, is so incredibly effective. Like I was saying yesterday, I just really appreciate how acutely this story understands that basketball itself is both a refuge and a torment for these characters. It's where they successfully perform a version of themselves for the town to consume. It's where they find safety in expressing their physicality and desire that would otherwise be deemed inappropriate. And it's a life raft offering them an escape from this small town that does not allow them to be themselves in the first place. That despair, that anger, that resentment the characters feel because their desire and the truth of themselves can only exist within these very strict boundaries is so palpable in the story. You can tell the characters are desperate for some kind of release and relief. And in so many ways, basketball is what makes them legible, what makes them even palatable to the people in their town and in their lives. By not only playing their best, but by winning, they're able to prove their quote-unquote usefulness to the people around them. They can ensure that they won't be cast away or ignored because they have value in the team, which becomes an addictive feeling that they have no choice but to chase. So I respect how the story is really grappling with the back and forth of these characters and their tumultuous relationship to the sport. It can absolutely be a beautiful, liberating experience by which they exercise their own agency, but it can also quickly become toxic and obsessive, which of course also maps onto the desire the characters feel for each other as well. I have roughly 2 hours left in the audiobook, and I'm listening to it at a few notches above 1x speed, so theoretically I could maybe finish this today? Stay tuned to see if I can actually make that happen. Switching gears, like I said, I did make a pretty good start on I Keep My Exoskeletons to Myself. I read just over 100 pages yesterday out of like 330-ish pages, so if I keep up that pace, I might be able to finish it either tomorrow or early Saturday latest. Just as a quick refresher, this is a speculative story where the government no longer punishes crimes with incarceration, but instead issues additional shadows for every crime a person commits. The main character has 2 shadows, we don't know why, and her recently born child, who she's raising on her own, was also born with a second shadow herself. That's the basic premise. We're just thrown in right away when the main character is at the Department of Balance trying to get them to remove her child's second shadow because obviously her child has no agency and she's an infant who has not purposefully or consciously committed any crimes. The idea of being issued additional shadows as a physical marker of wrongdoing or moral depravity is a concept I find really interesting. Every time the story gives us a little more context about how this technology was developed and what the social and legal norms surrounding it have become, I am deeply fascinated. At least so far though, the whole shadow concept is basically something happening in the background. We get little tidbits of information about this government program and the systemic oppression that Shadster's face, but it's not quite as fleshed out as I would like. I do, however, think that the story's distance from that concept is very much intentional. It's a reflection of how normalized this technology and this social marker has become, that it's not a pressing issue taking up a majority of the main character's focus. It's inconvenient and it's deeply unjust, but the character is also grappling with grief and struggling to raise a child on her own, which is not something that she ever anticipated doing. So not only is her energy taken up by those other things, but that distance is also showing how easily people adapt to everyday instances of privacy invasion and injustice. I also love how this story is being told. It's structured in what I would almost describe as vignettes. These little flashes of moments, sometimes connected, sometimes sequential, but sometimes just a burst of thought or an idea. That use of the short form is really compelling because it makes you want to keep reading, and it makes these high concept or sometimes heavy moments feel more digestible because it's coming in pieces. I have to research this more, but I feel like Marisa Crane had to be a poet in a past life. I know they wrote and published short fiction before this, but maybe there's some poetry in there as well, and if not, I firmly believe that a poetry collection should be in their future. Their mastery of language just has me in the palm of their hand. They're able to craft these achingly beautiful, searing sentences and passages full of yearning and thoughtfulness that just make me feel exactly what it is they want me to feel. The way they use imagery, the way they connect ideas with unexpected descriptors and sentiments is very reminiscent of what you tend to see in poetry, and their undeniably distinctive writing style is just hitting all the right notes. If I can get a little bit nerdy and go back to structure and craft, another really great thing this book is doing is that it's told in first person, but it's using a technique known as first person direct address. So the main character is narrating the story and their experiences from their first person perspective, but they're also addressing a character who exists off the page, which is their recently passed wife in this case. I think that is such a brilliant choice because not only does it allow the character and the story to explore the grieving process, but it also echoes the concept of shadows, of a nearby hovering darkness, of an absence, of an inverted state that's only revealed in the light and only exists in relation to where we are at any given time. The first person direct address is giving shape to an absence, to a void, and creating a sense of character that can only be accessed in relief to the main character. It is so good. It is so smart. But also, aside from that, there's a dark humor to the story that is surprisingly charming, especially given that the story is very much about surveillance and grief. It is about those things, but it's also very much about the foibles of being a new parent, how there is so much about raising a child that you are not told or that you cannot be taught beforehand, and how the roadmap is just something you have to make up along the way. So again, there's an aspect of wry humor and sometimes even a feeling of being disenchanted that I think draws the reader in even more to the story's distinct voice. I can't really speak much to this part yet, but the story is also bringing up concepts, ideas, and dynamics surrounding kink. And because so much about kink is power play and exchange of power, I'm really curious to see if the story will connect that thematically with the power that's being siphoned away from the main character by the surveillance state. There was a really interesting line in relation to kink that says the one who gives up power is the one who has all the power, which I thought was really striking. And again, I'm just kind of waiting to see if that connects back to the larger thematic work. I think I've rambled on long enough. Obviously, I'm enjoying both of these books immensely. I would love to finish A Sharp Endless Need today, but either way, we will both find out if that actually happened tomorrow. I did it. I finished A Sharp Endless Need, and it was fantastic, so let's talk about it. But first, just as an aside, you're going to see me wearing these slutty little tank tops in these last couple of updates because we are having an absolutely wild heat wave here in SoCal this weekend, and it is gross. But back to A Sharp Endless Need, I just knew from the opening passages that this was really going to be something special and this was really going to land for me, and I was right because I was just swept up in the story's momentum from start to finish. I've touched on this already, but there's a magnetism and an urgency to the writing, especially because of where the characters are in their lives. There's uncertainty, there's fear, there's this desperation the characters feel to both just be enough and also transcend above what they've been allowed to be up to this point. Basketball, as both a plot point and a metaphor, is such a beautiful vehicle for this story to explore all of those things. It's really successful as a driving force behind the story, as an element that allows the story to hang together, because without it, I think the story would feel much more meandering and possibly even pointless. And again, the sport is just a really effective framing device because it's a game that's as much about luck as it is about skill. It's a game that doesn't always love its players and its devotees back. It's an unforgiving game where one mistake or one injury can leave you with nothing. And the story does a great job of exploring who the characters truly are, both with and without the sport. And at the end of the day, I feel like this story is really about what it means to hunger, not just for success, but for validation. In what ways do we define ourselves? And in what ways do we allow ourselves to be defined by the people in our lives, the things we allow our identity to become tangled up in, and even in our circumstances? And in trying to find those answers and navigate those questions, the characters don't always turn to the right things. They don't always make the right choices. They set themselves up for failure or even punish themselves because they don't know what the right thing is. Something I don't want to forget to touch on is the fact that the story is also using basketball as a means to explore gender and the stereotypical relationship between female athletes and assumed masculinity. That's a really big topic that frankly I don't have the time, energy, or language to unpack in this moment, but a lot of female athletes are assigned markers of masculinity in order to quote-unquote justify their relationship to sport, or they're expected to exchange their femininity for credibility in order to be respected or even accepted in the world of sports. And of course, female athletes are no more or less feminine simply because they play sports, but that's still a power dynamic at play when it comes to athletic spaces. And the stereotype actually works out in Mac's favor in this case because she's afforded that ambiguity. She's allowed to explore her masculinity and her relationship to gender because she exists in that liminal and quote-unquote acceptable space, which is another reason why she's so obsessively devoted to the sport, even if she can't quite name it. I also think it's important to keep in mind that this is uncontestedly adult fiction. It is about teenagers and it's a really powerful coming of age narrative, but it's told from an adult perspective and it's written for adults. That said though, I think this definitely has crossover potential and appeal, no pun intended, because if you read a lot of YA or if you're part of the YA demographic but you're looking for something a bit more mature, something to help transition you to adult fiction, this could be a really great choice. I think it's pretty obvious I had a great time with this. Danny Martinek truly made a meal out of the audiobook as well. The way way they expressed heartache and desperation was just so incredibly believable. I just felt their performance so deep in my bones. This is definitely a new favorite, and I think I would give it 4.5 stars. I actually had a pretty successful day yesterday because not only did I finish that book as planned, but I did read another 100 pages of exoskeletons, so please clap. I don't know that I have too much new to add at this point. I'm still very much enjoying it and also appreciating the way the story is crafted. I do love that some of the vignettes are structured as pop quiz questions because not only is that a really creative use of the format, but it also echoes how the main character feels like life is just an endless series of unprompted tests. It's sort of referencing that isolating feeling that everyone else has all the answers and knows how the world is supposed to work, and yet you're just always trying to catch up and constantly failing to pass these unspoken litmus tests. And I think it also really speaks to the experience of being othered and being systematically oppressed. I will also say the story is grappling with heavy emotions and ideas, which makes sense because the inciting action of the story, the reason why there is a story to tell, is because the main character lost their wife. So naturally there's a lot of grief to navigate. But like I said before, it's not only balanced out by this wry sense of humor, but there's also this sort of slice of life domesticity to the story as well. It's very much about this character trying their best to raise their child, growing a relationship with their child steeped in love and discovery. And she's also relearning how to connect with other people and lean on other people, even and especially as the government is trying its best to isolate shadesters from the rest of society. So I appreciate how the story is exploring how connection is a form of resistance, especially in a time when fascism and authoritarianism are driving systems of power, especially when systems of power are actively invested in making life as untenable and unlivable as possible for those in the margins. As cheesy as it might sound, it reminds me of that line from Rent where they say the opposite of war isn't peace, it's creation. I feel like the story is exploring a similar sentiment where the opposite of oppression isn't peace or neutrality, which is a state of being so often policed by those in power, but rather it's connection, it's resistance. So definitely a lot to think about and consider. I'm still very much appreciating everything this story is doing so far. I do have kind of a busy day today. After work, I'm going to go hang out with a friend out of town. We're going to see Thunderbolts in IMAX and get some dinner. It's going to be super fun. This has been like the thing helping to motivate me through the work week. I'm not really sure where my reading time is going to fit into that. I'm going to try to read as much as I can before I go, and hopefully you'll get my final thoughts in my next update. Another slutty little tank top, another slutty little reading update. Also, if I look absolutely wrecked, it's because I am. I stayed up until like 1:30 a.m. last night finishing this book, but only because I couldn't stop reading. And you know what? It was worth every second of sleep that I lost. I feel like I've expressed my thoughts on this book pretty well so far. I think it's an incredibly beautiful story that's written with so much insight and so much tenderness. It's able to balance heavy, complex emotion with earnest moments of humanity and love. That was something I was really drawn to in the story, how it's not only following this main character as she learns to navigate grief and loss, but it's also about her journey back to love. It's about how she's relearning not only how to fall in love with other people again, but also how to fall back in love with herself. And that love that she's rediscovering isn't just romantic love, although that is something she realizes that she eventually wants for herself. But she's also falling in love with her child, with new friends, with new support systems, new possibilities, with the reality of how life after death is about holding both grief and joy at the same time. And I really love the reciprocal relationship between the main character and her child. It's not a power dynamic where it's a one-way street. Her kid not only surprises her, but also teaches her and also invites her to continue growing and changing by virtue of the fact that she is growing and changing herself. It's really interesting to think about how the two of them very deeply relate to each other because they both have multiple shadows, but also because they came to those shadows in very different ways, they also have their own unique experiences and perspectives. Especially because her kid was born with a second shadow, that's a very different experience than being issued another shadow later in life. So even though the two of them are very close and have that shared experience of being discriminated against and judged everywhere they go, growing up and only knowing that that version of the world shapes the kid into someone and something her mom could never expect. Like I was saying in my last update, I feel like this story is very much about how the opposite of oppression isn't necessarily this idyllic version of liberation. It's not freedom, it's not peace, it's resistance. And this story is showing all the big and small revolutions that the characters are experiencing and undertaking in their lives. It's not a story about heroically overcoming oppression or overthrowing the government. It's a story that tells us that if the state, if the powers that be want to take something away from us, they will take it. If they want to make our lives harder, they will find ways to do it. And while that's a very bleak reality, the story is equally about discovering that for every one thing that can be taken from us, there is so much more that can't be taken from us. And I feel like the story is very much a celebration of those people, those feelings, those experiences that are integrally part of us no matter what. I do think that things wrap up in the story a little bit too quickly to feel entirely organic, and sometimes the characters come to conclusions that, while incredibly resonant, feel a little bit unearned because they could have been better supported with a bit more development. And while intellectually I understand that the mechanics of this new legislation are not really the focus of the story, that is what drew me in the first place, and I feel like we could have stood to learn more about the logistics of that system, the tech behind it, and just more about how it works. We're given a little bit here and there, but it just doesn't quite feel like enough. But make no mistake, those are very minor quibbles. I would still give this a very strong 4.5 stars. It's funny because both books in this vlog ended up being 4.5 stars for me, but they're very different flavors of 4.5 stars, if that makes sense. But that does bring us to the end of the vlog. I think it was a really fantastic reading week, and I enjoyed myself so much. I would definitely call this taste test a success because I think I found a new favorite author to watch. I have so many more ideas for author taste tests in the future, so let me know if that's something you would like to see. And if you can think of an author that I've talked about wanting to read from who has more than one book currently published, let me know and I can add them to my list. And of course, if you read either of these books from Marisa Crane, or if you plan to, I would love to know what you think. I forgot to mention this earlier, but even though I was reading from an advanced copy of A Sharp Endless Need, it should actually be released by the time you see this. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will catch you next time.